My guest at this time is CJ Ciaramella. He's a reporter at Reason.com. He often writes about criminal justice issues, and on Wednesday, he told the stunning, horrific story of a Florida sheriff's deputy being charged on 52 felony counts for planting drug evidence on motorists that he pulled over, some of whom suffered tremendously because they were already in court-ordered recovery programs. So how did this happen? How was the officer caught? And what are the lessons for the rest of us? And CJ, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me. This all started about last year when a local Florida paper reported that the state's attorney office in Jackson County, Florida, was investigating a whole bunch of cases involving this one sheriff's deputy. His name is Zach Wester. They had essentially lost faith in him or his credibility as a witness and looked back through all of his old cases. And then a local paper found body cam footage from one of his traffic stops that appeared to show him planting a small baggie of methamphetamine in a woman's car. And in the body cam footage, you can see him sort of tuck it into his hand and try to, do a sort of sleight of hand measure and then drop it in the car and say, "Oh, look what I found here." And in the video, the woman is pretty clearly distraught and insisting that it's not hers. And after that came out, the deputy was suspended, and about a month later, he was fired. And the Florida Department of Law Enforcement launched a full investigation, and they went back and reviewed about 300 cases that he was involved with. And several more people came out after that, claiming that they had also been framed by this deputy. Some more body cam footage came out. I obtained body cam footage through a public records request that showed him pretty much blatantly lying about the results of a roadside drug test and falsely arresting a man. And then yesterday, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, as you mentioned, announced that he had been arrested, Zach Wester, and is now being charged with dozens of criminal charges for perjury, false imprisonment, possession of drugs, racketeering, which is a pretty serious charge. He's facing, I believe, up to 30 years in prison. And the prosecutors have said that they are not interested in a plea deal, which is a fairly significant statement and does not bode well for him.
Is there any sort of statement from his attorneys denying it or explaining it in any way, shape, or form?
No, he exercised his Fifth Amendment right during the investigation, and his lawyers have not commented to any of the papers as of right now. He is, like I said, facing some very serious charges. This is, as you may, it's very, very shocking. It's a huge black eye for the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. And there are also about, I believe, 3 or 4 federal civil rights lawsuits now pending against the deputy, Zach Wester, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Department, in addition to the criminal charges he's facing. So this is going to be a very expensive and long-running issue for this Florida county.
We're talking with CJ Ciaramella of Reason.com, and this planting of evidence would be horrific enough on its own, but as you point out so well in the story, some of these people that he framed faced major consequences if they were caught with drugs again. One in particular, I think his name was Ben Bowling, is the most horrific of all, losing custody of his own daughter, but other people, of course, going through absolute torment, trying to figure out how this could have happened to them and trying to clear their good name. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's one of the most disturbing parts about this thing is that a lot of his victims were people who had prior records, people who were in court-mandated recovery or required to take frequent drug tests. And he essentially preyed on them because, if their credibility, it came down to their word or this police officer's, it makes a pretty hard case for them. And this one guy in particular, Ben Bowling, was doing regular, consistent drug tests because he had recently regained custody of his daughter after a criminal DUI conviction. And when he was falsely arrested after Officer Wester allegedly planted methamphetamines in his car, he lost custody of his daughter. which is the most horrific outcome. But other people, were, as I mentioned, in court mandated recovery, or they had recently got out of prison and were trying to put their lives back together, and this completely upended their lives. It is sort of, a lot of the people he targeted were struggling or trying to put their lives back together, and it pretty much destroyed them.
Do we know if Mr. Bowling ever got his custody of his daughter back?
I do not know that, actually. I know in the case that I found, a lot of these cases, the charges got dismissed. In some cases, a judge vacated them. But I mean, in the video that I got through body cam footage, you can see this guy that he arrested after falsifying a roadside drug field test. The guy is breaking down and pretty much in tears. It's really not easy to watch, if I'm being honest. But his charges were later dismissed by the state prosecutor. And a lot of these people are going to have their day in court. You can be assured of that. They're going to take this department and this officer to federal court for civil rights charges, I can almost guarantee.
What's your assessment of how the Florida Department of Law Enforcement handled this? From what you wrote, it seems like they've been pretty aggressive on this.
Once this investigation started, it went on for about 10 months. A lot of the victims and the attorneys for them were not happy about the amount of time the investigation took. It did take about 10 months, but, the amount of charges that they brought back and the strength of the arrest warrant that they issued is, like I said, he's facing very severe charges. There was, the state's attorney office originally launched this internal probe of all these cases, and there was a whistleblower who later quit the office and said that she was retaliated against because after she brought up and initiated this whole thing and got the ball rolling. So, there's been intimations that the state's attorney's office wasn't perhaps as excited about pursuing this. But overall, the charges that come forward are very strong, and it does not look good for this officer.
CJ, one thing you also point out, I think in the story, but certainly on Twitter as well, is that a lot of these people consented to Deputy Wester searching their cars, and many people think they might not have any choice in that situation. But what rights do we have?
As Americans, you have a Fourth Amendment right to not consent to a search. If you're pulled over and an officer says, "Oh, you have any drugs or guns in the car?" and you say no, and the officer says, "Well, do you mind if I take a look around?" You have a Fourth Amendment right to say, "No, I do not consent to that search." And unless the officer has some sort of probable cause, they cannot just, search your car legally. A lot of Wester did this quite frequently, would say that he smelled burned marijuana or the odor of marijuana in the car, which the Supreme Court and other courts have ruled gives officers legal probable cause to search your car. So if an officer is really intent on lying, they can get around that refusal to search. But as I said, as an American, you do have a right to refuse or to not give your consent to a police search. So that is one protection that we have as Americans.
And finally, CJ, you write on these issues a lot. We assume most cops are honest. So based on your experience, is this an unusually exceptional case, or are there more of these stories emerging these days?
It is unusual in the scope of it and the breadth of the accusations against him. There have been cases of cops being fired or prosecuted for planting drugs before. There's a large scandal in Baltimore over their gun task force, basically acting as a robbery crew and planting drugs on people and stealing their stuff. So it goes on. What's stunning about this is the details that emerged and just how malicious it was. This wasn't a money-making scheme or something like that. I mean, the press conference yesterday, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement didn't speculate on why Deputy Wester did this, but the effect that it had on people's lives and the just callous disregard for their rights and for their lives was, I think, what makes this stand out so much.
Yeah, absolutely. The stress and a parent being ripped away from his daughter because of this sort of corruption absolutely breaks the heart, and hopefully that can be rectified as well. CJ, thank you so much for your time today and great reporting. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You bet. CJ Ciaramella is a reporter at Reason.com. Find his article on this incredible story there. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.